Thank you so much for coming on this first day of the last week of classes for many of us, and at this pretty early time in the day. So let me introduce our Dean, Andrew Polsky of the School of Arts and Sciences, who will welcome us on behalf of Hampshire College. And after two more welcoming remarks from Polina Barskova from Hampshire and myself, we will proceed to the conference itself.
Thank you, Yasha. Welcome to Hunter College. I'm pleased to be able to say a quick hello to you this morning. Although my last name is Polsky with a Y, I don't speak any Russian, so my contribution will be brief. As it happens, Yasha participates in a faculty writing seminar with us here at Hunter, and just last week he presented his paper on One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich and the story behind his publication, which I found absolutely fascinating. And as it happens, just at the same time, I was reading this book, The Sorrow of War, by Bao Ninh. It's a novel about North Vietnam during and after the American War, as they called it. And there's a fascinating parallel between the two books, because both were, in fact, published in the face of serious, severe government censorship. And what struck me as interesting when I read Yasha's paper and we were talking about it was not the book itself. I'm not a Russian literature scholar, but I was very interested in Yasha's analysis of the story behind its publication, why it was published, why Khrushchev approved its publication, why there was such a brief window for publication at that time. And I thought about it in the context of Bao Ninh's book, because this was also published in the face of intense censorship in Vietnam. It was after the war, it was some years after the war, but nevertheless, the censors still had to approve all publication. Governments depend upon myths. All regimes depend upon some myths, but it strikes me that some regimes feel at least that they're much more fragile if people start to question the myths and people start to penetrate behind it. In the case of Bao Ninh, he tells a very unheroic story about the Vietnam War from the perspective of a man in North Vietnam who fought for a decade and came home and his life was utterly ruined, the world was completely changed, and essentially he never recovered. So all the stories about the heroic struggle for the reunification of Vietnam essentially fall by the wayside. And yet, the censors, still eager to preserve the regime, allowed the book to be published, which is an interesting story in itself. Why would they do that? And I don't think there's a real clear answer surrounding this book. But I would say this, and it occurred to me in talking about this book, that books like this do get published because they serve the agenda of someone in power. Not sure who that is or what that agenda necessarily is. It's not necessarily straightforward or clear, but it's there because books like this and books like this don't come out in their countries unless someone in power approves of it and thinks it means it will advance some project that they're engaged in. I think we would find books like these in every authoritarian and totalitarian regime, when they come to light, tell an interesting story about the politics behind it. As a political scientist, that's my own interest in the subject. So I bid you a successful conference. I look forward to hearing more about it as you go on. I'm sorry that my duties as dean will carry me away from the conference today, but such is life and my position. So I wish you a very good conference. Thank you for inviting me.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming here. Thank you so much for participating in what promises to be an exciting and difficult, and this is my main point, possibly the first event of its kind. The first conference of such scale and I dare say ambition dedicated to the problem and phenomenon of Tamizdat. I would like to add a rather trivial and nevertheless poignant consideration that we're meeting today and tomorrow to discuss Tamizdat, the literature separated and shaped by politics at the times, again, when relationships between, I dare say, East and West are far from any kind of harmony. So from the perspective of today, we're looking again at the yesterday, trying to make sense of it. I hope that questions that will surface, that will become evident in the course of our conversations, in the course of our papers, in the course of our discussions, will help us to move forward this very important discussion. I greet you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, my dear co-organizer of this very important conference. What we like to believe is a very important event, especially nowadays, as Polina just said. Before I say any few words that have to do with the subject matter itself, let me once again thank our Dean of the Arts and Sciences, who just left, but who supports the conference. Let me also thank immensely Ron Meyer and the Harriman Institute of Columbia University for their support, and the Department of Russian and Slavic Studies of NYU for the same reason, as well as the Presidential Fund for Student Engagement of Hunter College, and we will explore more Hunter premises during lunchtime. I thought it would be appropriate to open this conference with a short quote from Joseph Brodsky's speech in memorial of Karl Profer from 1984, of course. Normally, when one reads a book, one seldom thinks of its publisher. One is grateful to its author. The specifics of Russian history, however, made the publisher no less an important figure than a writer, made this distinction shrink considerably the way distinctions do in adversity. So I hope, I do not want to reduce, of course, the presentations and our discussions in the next 2 days to this distance between the publisher and the reader and the author, but I think it is productive to be thinking of book publishing as a triangle. To build up on this geometrical shape, it is perhaps also productive to think of the period that we will be discussing, of the late Soviet period, not as a dichotomy or polarity between the official and the non-official fields of cultural production, but rather as a triangular, dynamic, transcontinental and transnational model with Tamizdat as its base, because it does absorb both the unofficial and the official elements of the two opposite axes of that triangle. I would like to ask all of us in the course of the conference to perhaps develop, cultivate, and rethink what Tamizdat is. We do not necessarily have to have a working definition of it right now, but we can probably define it as a corpus of manuscripts rejected or never submitted for publication at home, but smuggled through various channels across the curtain and printed outside the USSR with or without their author's knowledge or consent, and not infrequently for the purpose of being sent back as ideologically suppressive material. Perhaps we can think of how this working definition should be made more accurate. Another aspect or purpose, I think, of our discussion should be the periodization. While it's pretty much clear where it ends, 91 or the perestroika years, it is more problematic to find its point of departure. Should it be Alexander Herzen and the middle of the 19th century? Should it be the late 1920s, the Zametin and Pilniak affair? Or should it be Dr. Zhivago, 1957, which really pokes the first hole in the Iron Curtain through which other manuscripts reach the West to be published for the first time, long before they see the light of day in Russia, during or after Perestroika. Thank you in advance for your contributions, and I think we can begin our first panel. Thank you once again.